This presentation outlines the structure of the logical database that supports the proposed Stroke Rehab App. It identifies the main classes of data objects that can represent the knowledge that needs to be collected, stored, and distributed to various stakeholders. It should be clearly understood that this presentation attempts to identify the key logical data objects that represents the knowledge, understanding, and decision-making processes of neurologists, clinicians, and therapists about the long-term recovery and rehabilitation of stroke survivors. The data objects described here are ones that reflect a scientifically trained stroke survivor's perception of that knowledge, understanding, and those processes. Obviously, this will need to be carefully reviewed following discussions with expert neurologists, clinicians, and therapists. The Stroke Rehab App will need to be built around a carefully designed database, which contains a central database running on a database server and a large number of peripheral databases running on a variety of computers ranging from tablet computers such as the Apple iPad or iPhone, personal computers including desktop and notebook personal computers, and departmental or corporate mainframe computers or servers. These peripheral computers will be able to communicate with the central database via the Internet using standard web-based technologies and encrypted XML data packages for the purpose of downloading data from or uploading data to the central database. They will not be able to transfer data directly with one another apart from audio and video calls made using technologies such as Apple's FaceTime or Skype. So they will only be able to pass data packages between each other via the central database. There will be a number of different groups or types of peripheral computers. Basically, one type for each stakeholder group associated with the Stroke Rehab App. Each type will contain selections of data from the central database that are relevant only to individual members of that stakeholder group. Hence, the device used by a particular stroke survivor will only contain data that is relevant to that stroke survivor. Similarly, the device used by a particular stroke therapist will only contain data that is relevant to that stroke therapist. This will be done to limit the possibility of the accidental disclosure of sensitive medical data from devices. This also means that the computer that runs the central database must contain the intelligence to determine what data is needed by each and every peripheral device. This overall architecture allows data in the central database to be sourced from and accessed by a wide variety of existing computer systems and databases, including medical record databases in hospitals and any government-controlled databases associated with future e-health systems. Hence, the Stroke Rehab App will include a central database running on an SQL database server and accessible from any device using standard web-based technologies over the internet. It will also include survivor databases running on tablet computers such as the Apple iPad. There will be a separate survivor database for each individual stroke survivor. Each survivor database will only contain data relevant to the survivor to whom the iPad is issued. And each survivor database will only ever transfer data to or from the central database. There will also be therapist databases running on devices such as the Apple iPad or a desktop or notebook personal computer. There will be a separate therapist database for each individual therapist. Each therapist database will only contain data relevant to that therapist. And each therapist database will only ever transfer data to or from the central database. There will also be other stakeholder databases running on a variety of computing devices. Each of these stakeholder databases will only ever transfer data to or from the central database. Each stakeholder device will use browser-based apps to access the central database. And each stakeholder database will use XML technology to transfer data to or from the central database. This diagram identifies the main classes of data objects that represent the knowledge that needs to be collected and maintained in the central database, and then distributed amongst various survivor databases, therapist databases, and assorted stakeholder databases. I have grouped these data object classes into 3 groups. In part 2 of this presentation, we will look at the data object classes shaded in grey, which represent key medical concepts that are relevant to all people who suffer strokes. In part 3, we will look at the data object classes shaded in red, which represent concepts involved in the acute care setting where the damage caused by an individual's stroke is assessed. And in part 4, we will look at the data object classes shaded in mauve, which represent concepts involved in the rehabilitation of individual stroke survivors in the subacute care or community settings. To summarise this section, the Stroke Rehab App needs to be built around a distributed database, where the central database acts as the primary information store, and many stakeholders will have access to peripheral databases that reside on various types of computing devices, such as the iPad, desktop or notebook computers, or departmental or corporate computers. The types of computer chosen for different stakeholder groups will depend on their needs. And each stakeholder will have access to a peripheral database that only contains data that is relevant to that individual stakeholder. All peripheral databases will be connected to the central database via the Internet, and all data flows between peripheral databases will occur via the central database. The central database will be designed to support the storage of data objects that represent general medical concepts, stroke assessment concepts, and stroke therapy concepts. And the central database will have complete control over the loading of relevant data into peripheral databases used by specific stakeholders.